Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are carrying a series on Western political thought, and so far we have conducted a numerous session discussing about the political thoughts of the various, I would say, the philosophers. Dear friends, today we would be discussing on a liberal thinker, J.S. Mill. We would be discussing on the political thoughts of J.S. Mill, and for this discussion we have again with us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Aryabhat College, Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. So dear friends, let's welcome our guest Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, under whose able guidance we are going to understand the political thoughts of J.S. Mill, the political thinker J.S. Mill, who is be the part of our lecture today. So welcome to the EduSet lecture, sir.
Thank you, Geetika ji. In fact, today we are going to discuss political thought of J.S. Mill, one of the pioneer in terms of understanding liberal political thought in the West. J.S. Mill has been studied and has been interpreted and referred as one of those thinkers of modern times who champion the cause of liberty and to some extent also democracy. Of course, that is a contested proposition because the scholars, one scholar has also referred him as a reluctant Democrat, that he was Democrat but reluctantly he was pursuing democratic agenda. But nonetheless, on the question of liberty, he is unquestionably perhaps one of the most authoritative voice emanating from the West on in terms of its importance for human society and so on and so forth. So in fact, J.S. Mill has had a very multifaceted personality in terms of writings and in terms of his engagement with number of issues in sphere of thought and action. For example, Mill, if one looks at some of the writings which he produced over the years, one clearly finds that Mill covered a whole host of areas which come under political philosophy, politics, economics, in fact metaphysics and so on and so forth. In fact, by the time he was 8, he had read Plato and Aristotle. In fact, when he was growing up as a kid, as a son of another illustrious thinker from the West, James Mill, his father, who was a utilitarian, a kind of collaborator and great friend of the founder of utilitarian school, Jeremy Bentham. In fact, Mill was privileged to have access to different types of literature, different type of ideas and different type of views in home itself. Interestingly, when John Stuart Mill, the son of James Mill, when he was born, in fact it is believed that James Mill told Bentham that he would be carrying the flag of our utilitarian philosophy in our school high. But interestingly, by the time J.S. Mill ended or signed off, in fact he revised and tried to revise some of the basic premises and the principles of utilitarianism to the extent that many people believe that it was very difficult to recognize the utilitarianism of Bentham and James Mill era. So in fact, these are some of the things happened in course of his intellectual evolution or intellectual journey, which we will basically take up in course of our discussion. But one thing is very simple, one thing is very clear, that John Stuart Mill came from 19th century, a century which is considered to be very important in terms of intellectual movements, in terms of the new churnings which were taking place in the West. Born in 1806 and he basically lived till 1873. A British philosopher. In fact, John Stuart Mill in fact had also the opportunity to serve in the East India Company in fact, which was one of the coveted positions in England those days, and his basically association with East India Company enabled him to basically have the first hand experience of the colonial situation, the situation which was prevailing in different colonies including India. So, therefore, when we come to this question of representation, democracy and so on and so forth, which basically he reflected on in his book on representative government, we find that James Mill had the privilege to see both situations, the western situation as well as its counterpart in the colonies. It is of course true that James Mill, some of his positions, intellectual positions and ideas on representation and democracy do not augur well with his credential as a liberal thinker. For example, he did not consider those who did not belong to the West, particularly the modern liberal civilized West, so called civilized West, to be fit for democracy. Even in colonies, he made a distinction between white colonies like Australia, New Zealand and so on and so forth, and the colonies which were not white like India, in terms of transference of the right of representation and participation in governance. So, I mean, these are some of the contentious issues where a lot of people believe that some amount of racism, or one can say that his biases and prejudices which characterize most of the political thought of that period perhaps can also be seen in J.S. Mill political thought. But nonetheless, one thing is very clear, that some of the issues which he tried to address in course of his intellectual journey were central to utilitarianism, which basically to which his father James Mill belonged, and his friend Bentham, I mean his father's friend Bentham was perhaps the originator or the founder of that movement or that school. So, therefore, some of the concerns at that time which were there before him, he tried to address them, but in course of addressing those concerns, John Stuart Mill came forward with some very refreshing ideas, and those ideas have become so important for liberalism as a whole and liberal political thought as a whole, that it becomes difficult to discuss or study liberalism without referring to John Stuart Mill. One of the reason is that liberty, which is perhaps one of the core values of liberalism, in fact is the central theme in the entire discourse which we basically see taking place or shaping around John Stuart Mill's political thought. Now, in terms of this utilitarianism, there are few things which we should remember at the very beginning, that he was an adherent to the utilitarian philosophy, there is no doubt. In fact, he simply wanted to refine it, he wanted to enrich it, he wanted to fine tune it. In course of that, he basically inserted certain other principles. In course of that, he basically brought in certain other issues into the discussion, due to which utilitarianism underwent significant changes. In fact, a lot of scholars also believe that the way utilitarianism was interpreted, understood and propagated, John Stuart Mill got disillusioned, and therefore, in fact, he wanted to make corrections, he wanted to modify and revise some of the premises of utilitarianism. In fact, and that revision was basically to the extent that a lot of people believe that he basically radically transformed this entire discourse called utilitarianism. So much so that one statement is also attributed to John Stuart Mill when he said that I am a Peter who denied the master, in the sense that he is someone who was basically seen as the flag bearer of this school, as a flag bearer of this philosophy, but he ended up in a situation where he completely transform this entire discourse. Now, one thing is quite clear here, that the situation in which John Stuart Mill found himself and the situation in which Bentham and his father James Mill were placed was totally different. In fact, Mill had a different situation to negotiate with. John Stuart Mill had a different type of social situation economic situation and the transformations which were taking place in the Western world. For example, in Bentham's time, because one of the priorities or the concerns of Bentham's writings, as we have discussed in our earlier lectures, was law and administration, and therefore he is even today considered to be one of the most important voices so far as law and jurisprudence are concerned. So, Bentham's priorities were law and administration, because these issues were important during his time, because the way capitalism was developing, the way the transformations were taking place in society, economy, culture and so on and so forth, there was a dire need, there was a need for basically streamlining law and jurisprudence, and therefore, it was the call of the hour, and Bentham basically rose to the occasion, responded to this call, and provided perhaps one of the most profound discourse on law and jurisprudence. But during John Stuart Mill's time, situation had changed considerably, and it was basically a situation in which democracy was on ascendancy. It was the time when democratic aspirations were rising. It was the time when more and more societies were moving in direction of democratization. Therefore, along with this democratization, new challenges were being thrown up, new contradictions were emerging, and apart from this democracy, what we also find that during that period, the kind of economic inequality, social inequality which were growing in those societies were also creating many new divisions in society, and those divisions had to be addressed, because on the one hand we find that that was the period when basically this quest for equality, the quest for dignity, the quest for a better life in terms of new ideas like socialism and other things were also growing, because 19th century also we remember as a century which we have had a thinker like Karl Marx. We have had many other brands of socialism or visions about the future society. Some of them are referred as utopian socialism, so on and so forth. So, therefore, it was a different context in which John Stuart Mill was basically writing, John Stuart Mill was thinking, and John Stuart Mill was reflecting on. Therefore, what we have to see that when we make a comparison between Bentham and Mill and the kind of two different horizons, we should keep these different situations in mind. Now, during John Stuart Mill's time, a very interesting writing came up, and that inspired and influenced Mill considerably, and that was Lex Tocqueville, the French thinker, and his work called Democracy in America in 2 volumes. And basically what Tocqueville did, that he basically highlighted the pitfalls of democracy, particularly in terms of the tyranny of majority and the propensity in terms of basically suppressing the views of the minorities, and therefore he basically highlighted this possible fallout of democracy in the coming years, and this basically influenced Mill to a great extent in his ideas, in the evolution of his ideas. When he started thinking in terms of plural voting, when he started thinking in terms of proportional representation, when he started thinking in terms of giving more weightage to the minority voices, when he thought, when he started talking in terms of not suppressing the dissenting view, the minority view, even if the majority of the opinion thought otherwise, even if there was one view which didn't subscribe to it, even there was one view which didn't conform to it, that view had to be honored and respected. And because largely on account of the fact that this freedom of thought expression, in Mill's opinion, was one of the most important factor which contributes to the development of human personality. So, therefore, all these issues gradually got interlinked and basically became part of this Mill's political thought in terms of democracy and liberty, the role of a state and so on and so forth. And therefore, he moved far away from what utilitarian philosophy talked of and what utilitarian philosophy stood for. Now, in fact, to the extent that the period which preceded Mill, we have had liberal thinkers who were talking of laissez-faireism, a kind of philosophy in which the interference of a state is basically is restricted, in which the a state is not considered to be fit to interfere or basically intervene in social matters, in economic matters, and basically the celebrated statement of Adam Smith that the best this hidden hands of the market, or this this statement that best government is that which governs the least. So, all these things, all these dictums and other things basically characterize the period which preceded Mill, but during Mill's time I think since the situation was changing, the challenges were different, therefore, Mill also revised his opinion on the role of the state, and it is here that many people find that we get the first impression of a nascent welfare state in the West. Of course, it was not in form of welfarism, but it was in form of a positive state. So, on the one hand, many scholars believe that Mill stood for negative liberty and positive state. Many people would attribute even some amount of welfarism emerging through the ideas and writings of Mill, which of course crystallized much later, particularly in 20th century. So, therefore, Mill's influence in terms of influencing subsequent course of events in terms of politics and ideas are also to be understood here. Now, one thing is, as I mentioned earlier, that liberty remained perhaps the most important theme in Mill's political thought, and he was basically uncompromising on the question of liberty. Now, it is not just a chance that he is considered as a great liberal thinker, and this can be attributed to his uncompromising stand on the question of liberty. Now, in fact, themes of liberty runs through all aspects of his political thought. In fact, it can be seen in terms of his revision of utilitarian principles. This commitment on liberty can be seen in his critique of democracy. This commitment of liberty can also be seen in his defense of the welfare state, and last but not the least, this can also be seen in his entire quest for the upliftment of women, or taking up the question of the subjugation of women in the society. So, therefore, liberty was a running theme in all the writings of Mill and all the ideas which he basically championed and talked about. Now, some of the works of John Stuart Mill are to be remembered, because those writings are still quite popular. Some of people still social scientists still go back to those writings because they have acquired the stature of a classics. There is no time space barrier to it, because some of the ideas are even today as relevant as they were then. For example, in 1843 he produced a book called System of Logic. In 1848 he basically wrote that Principles of Political Economy. In 1859 he produced that celebrated work called On Liberty. In 1861 he came out with a book called a writing called Considerations on Representative Government, which is still a celebrated writing on democracy and representation. In 1863 he produced Utilitarianism, a book on utilitarianism, and finally 1869 his Subjection of Women, that writing came up. So, therefore, we find that from time to time Mill is coming out with different set of ideas and different writings and covering a whole host of issues. Rather, he covered a very wide and wide ground in terms of issues and in terms of the ideas. Now, not only that, he also had an experience of an active practitioner of politics. For example, he became member of House of Commons, of course for a very short period of time, but nonetheless he was a member of House of Commons, that is Parliament. And his experience in the Parliament was not, of course, as as happy as, or one can say as laudable as that we find in his writings or in his intellectual journey. So, one can say that as a politician Mill's graph was not as bright as perhaps as an intellectual or as a philosopher or as a thinker. Now, in terms of these varied interests, apart from the fact that I mentioned that he also served East India Company, which was one of the coveted positions in England those days, and by having a first hand experience of administration and governance, Mills perhaps could see the different facets of state and administration, it was not only armchair intellectualism which normally thinkers are basically alleged to be doing. So, therefore, Mill's experience also contributed in terms of enrichment of his thought and enrichment of ideas. Now, on the question of this state and its role, we have seen that how this laissez-faireism as a discourse was quite dominant during the time of Mill, and Mill moved away from laissez-faireism to the extent that it also amounted to giving some unbridled power to the state, which we will take up later when it comes to the question of liberty. For example, many people allege that the way Mill defined liberty, he defined liberty in two different ways. One is the man is sovereign over his body and thought, and that is liberty. When man's sovereignty is restored on his body, on his mind, then one can say that one is enjoying liberty. So, complete freedom, freedom to experiment with life kind of situation. But on the other hand, there is another definition which also comes from Mill, that basically one should be free to do what one desires, and this question of what one desires is a highly subjective proposition, and that has led to many interpretations and criticism. For example, it is also alleged that if someone is walking on a bridge, and if there is a threat that he will fall from the bridge, and if a state intervenes and prevents him from falling into the river or the sea, then a state is justified, because freedom or liberty implies what one should do what one desires to do, and no one desires to fall in a river and die, and therefore, this interference of a state will be justified, and therefore, it goes very close to what the idealists normally define liberty or freedom as forced to be free. So, therefore, a lot of scholars, the critics point out that Mill started from a premise which was very close to liberalism, but ended at a situation where he compromised considerably the basic principle of liberalism, that is freedom and autonomy. So, anyway, this is matter of interpretation. We will come to this when we will take up this question of liberty in particular. Now, this question of a state, as I was discussing, that was the dominant principle at that time was laissez-faireism, and in fact utilitarianism, which Bentham was the founder and his father James Mill subscribed to, believed in a principle of state action, that a state should intervene or interfere minimally in individual activities, because the only purpose for which a state has to interfere is the greatest happiness of the greatest number, because pleasure is the ultimate mission. The idea of good life means a pleasant life. So, pleasure and whatever gives happiness, whatever gives pleasure should be the mission of the state. So, therefore, within the utilitarian framework, the state intervention is highly restricted. In fact, even if it happens only with one clear cut defined purpose, that is to increase happiness and pleasure. Now, it was basically a time when entire West was experiencing a different type of situation or different type of development, that was expansion of the market economy, and therefore, the market economy and the new class, the emergent class, the bourgeoisie, particularly the capitalist enterprises, they wanted free play in the market, and they did not want a state to basically tamper with the rule of the market, the logic of the market, the hidden hands of the market, as it is normally believed. So, therefore, the restriction of a state's activity was one of the important principle which characterized the entire liberal thought of that period, and utilitarianism was no exception to this rule. Now, of course, what Mill does, that Mill addresses this question in terms of many issues, particularly in terms of his take on the question of happiness, on question of pleasure, on question of utility. In fact, without saying that he is deviating from utility as a principle of a good life, but nonetheless this ethical position, though he adheres to utilitarianism, but he brings in new factors, and those new factors are so radically transforming, though radically different from the earlier factors, that it leads to a different type of discourse on state role and state's function in society. So, therefore, on the one hand you have the restricted state intervention or restricted state action in utilitarian discourse. In Mill we find an extension of state activity for the general welfare, that for the welfare of the masses a state has to basically interfere, but in terms of dealing with inequality, in terms of dealing with many other issues. For example, it is here that one should remember even actions, individual actions. He makes a distinction between two different types of actions, self-regarding action and other regarding action. And he believed that in self-regarding actions, human beings should be given full autonomy, full freedom. There shouldn't be any interference from the outside the force, from outside. Rather, in fact, the freedom of thought, the freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, these are the internal domain of human beings, and they are totally self-regarding matters, and therefore state shouldn't interfere into these matters. But when it comes to the other regarding action, he gave some amount of space for state action and state interference. So, therefore, this distinction of self-regarding and other regarding becomes very significant and important for his take on the state and its role in society. Now, this so therefore, many people believe that in this other regarding action, that is the liberty or the freedom of not thought, but freedom of action, freedom of association, the three elements of liberty which he gave. One is a freedom of thought, expression and conscience, then is a freedom of action, and the third is freedom to form association. The three, out of three, in the first he doesn't allow any interference by outside force, but in second and third, that is in freedom of action and freedom of association, form association, he basically allows some interference from the outside. And it is here that he is laying the foundation of a new discourse, that is the positive role of the state within broad liberal society and the liberal discourse. So, therefore, this positive role of a state emerges even in terms of this utilitarianism, which I was discussing just now. In fact, the revision of these original premises which Mill does, basically this revision takes place on three important issues. First, in fact, he brings in this qualitative principle in this entire calculus, that is called utilitarian calculus or philosophic calculus, though of course he did not agree with this philosophic calculus, he called it a totally absurd. So, this bringing in of this qualitative element, that how the quality of pleasure is more important than quantity, because Bentham believed that the quality does not matter, it is quantity. He basically is the statement which is attributed to him that spin or poetry, it hardly matters, they will give equal pleasure. But Mill would say that this is not true. The quality of pleasure also matters, what type of pleasure one is getting, higher pleasure or lower level pleasure. If one gets higher level of pleasure, then one would not go for a lower level pleasure. So, the quality of pleasure is more important than the quantity of pleasure, and this is a very fundamentally transforming position which J.S. Mill takes on the question of pleasure and happiness. Now, in fact, the utilitarians believe, they believe that the physical pleasure is the only pleasure human beings seek, and therefore, the purpose of the state should be to augment this physical pleasure. But Mill would say that along with physical pleasure, human beings also go for development of moral and intellectual pleasure. So, therefore, moral and intellectual pleasure are perhaps the higher level of pleasure, and one cannot say that human beings do not aspire for that pleasure. So, therefore, high quality pleasure is preferable to one of a low quality pleasure according to this statement of John Stuart Mill. In fact, that celebrated statement of J.S. Mill is often cited when he said that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It is better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the pig and the fool are of a different opinion, it is largely on account of the fact that they have not seen the other side of the pleasure. So, therefore, this statement tells us clearly that how he gave importance to the quality of the pleasure, that what type of pleasure is to be preferred and what type of pleasure is to be subordinated. Now, it is in this context that we find the second important revision or second important modification which we happening within this utilitarian discourse through the intervention of J.S. Mill, and that is because his self-regarding action and other regarding action which I was referring to earlier, because the utilitarians believed that there is nothing called self and other regarding actions, and the state should keep away from all activities of society and economy. Rather, the state's purpose is only to basically increase the happiness, greatest happiness of greatest number, and whatever it does, it should does only to increase that happiness. But here we find a very very subtle, or one said the nuance distinction being made by J.S. Mill between self-regarding and other regarding action. Now, he believed that a state regulation of other regarding action could be justified because other regarding actions could lead to some implications for the communities, for members of the society, and therefore, individuals it was beyond the beyond the purview of individuals' own role or individuals' own jurisdiction. Therefore, whenever a state intervened in those actions which had implication for others, then state's intervention was justifiable or had to be justified. Now, this conditional departure from laissez-faire doctrine we find here materializing with this distinction of self-regarding and other regarding action. Now, this revision of utilitarianism, in fact, in John Stuart Mill, is largely on account of the fact that Mill's entire discourse was geared to basically promote human development, which was ignored by Bentham and his father James Mill. So, human development, which basically includes dignity, self-respect, esteem, and many other similar considerations, were not given due importance by the utilitarian thinkers, but Mill is perhaps giving more importance to these issues. As I talked about earlier, that in Mill's time it was a situation of a social turmoil. The society was passing through a turbulent phase, and there were basically the voices emerging from different quarters which were basically feeling unhappy or let down by the developments which were taking place in Europe at that time. So, Mill's concern was also to address those issues, and that is why this growing popularity of some revolutionary and radical ideas was not just a chance, but it was largely on account of the prevailing social situation. So, therefore, Mill, when he talked of developmental dimension of democracy, when he talked of human development, when he talked of dignity, development of personality, honor, esteem and other things, that these things also matter for human beings, not just material well-being or satisfaction of material needs, then perhaps he was addressing these issues. But one thing should remember, that in spite of these modifications and alterations, his commitment to utilitarian philosophy, at least in terms of appearance, never wavered. In fact, he maintained a old adherence to this utilitarian discourse, and ultimate standard for judging moral issues remained that utilitarian principle of Bentham and his father Mill. But only difference one can see that he expanded and made it look more human than perhaps it was earlier. So, therefore, this humane phase, one can say that he brought a humane phase to this entire utilitarian discourse by bringing in this question of dignity, honor, esteem and development. Now, even liberty, on the question of liberty, in fact, one should remember that Mill made liberty the core of this new utilitarianism which he was talking of. Now, to the extent that he said that those who have tested liberty will not exchange it for anything else, and that celebrated Greek adage that those who have tested the water of Nile will not basically exchange it for any other water. So, that type of situation one can see here, that those who have tested liberty will not exchange it for anything else. Now, in order to promote liberty of individual, he basically allowed a state innumerable actions and activities, even universal education, that a state could even go for providing universal education if it promoted liberty of individuals or human beings in society. Now, in terms of this the liberty, that which was basically one of the most abiding theme in Mill's political thought, or one can say that it was one of the core issues which basically we find in his entire corpus of writings. We find three different dimensions of liberty which I also mentioned earlier: liberty of thought, liberty of expression and liberty of action. And in this liberty of thought, he believed that it is totally an internal domain of human beings, because it relates to inner self, inner world, where basically the outside interference would not be allowed at all, because this is totally a self regarding matter. Now, on the question of liberty, we also find certain very interesting issues emerging on the issue of toleration, on the issue of dissent, protest and so many other things. So much so that even today, when we discuss freedom of thought and expression and the question of censorship, in fact, at times Mill's writings are cited and referred, and Mill is remembered. Sorry, because what Mill did, that he raised these issues while discoursing on this question of liberty and autonomy of individual. Now, Sabine, one of the most celebrated commentators on Western political thought, he believes that in Mill's writings, or for Mill, one can say that the threat to liberty is not coming only from the government, but also from majority that is intolerant to the unconventional and the divergent minority. So, this question of tolerance was very important, and he did not consider that this this threat to this liberty or the freedom of thought and expression can come only from a state. He believed that it can come also from the majority if the majority is not tolerant, or if he wants to basically suppress or basically trample upon the opinion of the minority. And this is very important from the point of view of democracy, because this is why one finds that why Tocqueville's writing Democracy in America, where he talks of tyranny of majority, had such a lasting influence on John Stuart Mill, because even if he believed in democracy, but he believed the way democracy was functioning in modern times in fact was inimical to the interest of the minorities. Of course, when he talked of minorities, the minorities in his writings are a different type of minorities: those who are educated, those who are rich, those who are wise, those who are more skilled, and their number is less, and therefore, those who are unskilled, those who are not educated, those who are poor, they can trample upon the views and opinions of these handful of minorities who are more competent and qualified people. And Mill believed that the democracy and the government cannot run without the assistance and the help of these qualified people. So, therefore, he basically got exercised with this issue, that how these minorities and their opinion and their voices should be made audible, how they can be put in a situation where they play a more important and decisive role in the governance of the society. So, therefore, he was addressing a question of minority and majority within democracy in a different terms, in the class terms, in terms of other social and cultural values, unlike other minorities and other problems which we today discuss, when we discuss democracy in terms of majority minority problem, that is the fixed minorities, the community, and ethnic groups, minorities and majorities. But nonetheless, at level of idea, what Mill was talking is still quite relevant in dealing with this question of majority and minority within democracy. Now, that brings me to the question of democracy, which is perhaps another important issue so far as Mill's political thought is concerned. And this liberty, the entire question of liberty is tied to this question of democracy. Now, what happens that he addresses this question of democracy in both writings, on liberty as well as on the representative government. Now, Mill believed that danger to liberty is happening in democracy more than perhaps in any other system, and that is quite interesting, because normally it is believed that democracy is a system which should basically protect liberty and should promote liberty. But Mill had a different viewpoint on this. He believed that democracy beyond a point may become a threat to liberty, and it is here that he is basically getting influenced or inspired by Tocqueville's findings in Democracy in America, that celebrated writing. Now, in Mill's opinion, like Tocqueville, he believed that democracy is becoming synonymous with majority rule. Now, Tocqueville, as it is normally believed, that Tocqueville argued that extension of democracy in social sphere basically has led to the tyranny of majority through public opinion, that is the majority opinion, and therefore dissenting position, or basically a non-conformist position, or any position which is not the part of this majority opinion, is totally ignored and crushed. Now, this something which Mill believed that was a very dangerous or ominous trend in modern times, so far as so far as liberty and autonomy of individuals is concerned. Now, curtailment of this individual autonomy and loss of liberty both are happening along with this expansion of democracy and expansion of democratic ideas. Now, of course, when he talks of Mill talks of liberty, he believes that there are varieties of interest and opinion, and they should be encouraged in the society, even if they are not basically comfortable, or they are not in tune with the majority opinion, but nonetheless all opinions, all viewpoints, all interests have to be promoted, and this is how a democracy can add more value to human personality, or the development of human personality and the growth of human identity. So, therefore, this is very significant from the point of view of even today's context of democratic governance and democratic politics, that how different interests, different views and different opinions have to be celebrated. Instead of going by the majority opinion, even if there is one voice, even that voice has to have some space in our discourse. Now, Mill believed that democracy basically stands for conformity of opinion and attitudes, and therefore it is a great threat to individual liberty, because only those who conform to this majority opinion basically find safe and secure, and those who are not part of this conformist opinion, their views are totally ignored and sometimes they are crushed. So, therefore, this is one of the dangerous trends in the opinion of Mill so far as the prospect of democracy is concerned. Now, Mill also believed that liberty should basically mean the full development of personality, and the full development of personality includes dignity, honor, esteem, freedom of thought, expression, of course, action and association. Of course, he wanted to make it contingent on other regarding action principle, that if, because there are other regarding, therefore the state has to monitor it. But so far as this this thought and expression are concerned, at least thought is concerned, human beings should have a full autonomy. It is here that one of the most celebrated liberal commentator on liberal political thought, or the modern liberal democratic system, C.B. Macpherson, he believes that with John Stuart Mill, a new concept of democracy started developing, and that was the developmental concept of democracy, where you had a protective concept of democracy developing with Bentham and James Mill, his father James Mill. With John Stuart Mill, we find a new concept, a new discourse of democracy taking shape and taking root, and it is a developmental concept, that is development of human personality, that how democracy can contribute in the development of human personality, in the development of dignity, honor, sense of esteem in human beings, and therefore democracy should not simply lead to creation of those structures and institutions which can provide protection to individuals in a market situation. Rather, it should also think in terms of creating certain other conditions in which human personality is fully developed and realized. So, therefore, in fact, as we discussed earlier, that in his discourse on democracy and liberty, in fact, liberty perhaps is the main scale on which he measures everything, including democracy, the functions of state, and the entire utilitarian discourse. Even in terms of defining liberty, as I mentioned earlier, that we find the three different forms through which it expresses itself: freedom of thought and expression, then there is freedom of action, and the third is freedom of association. And he gives full liberty to the freedom of thought and expression, but limited amount of liberty in freedom of action and freedom of association, because in his opinion they are other regarding action. And therefore, in fact, he believes that even if in the first matter, this freedom of thought and expression, there shouldn't be any restriction. Now, he celebrated a statement that all mankind minus one were of one opinion, one were of a contrary opinion, it will not be justified in silencing one person, one opinion. That even if the entire all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and if there was one person who was of a contrary opinion, that opinion should not be silenced, rather it should be heard, it should be honored. And this is how basically a democratic society can think in terms of basically developing human personality and putting in place a more human order. Now, freedom of thought and expression, as I mentioned, that he believed was the inward domain and therefore outside the purview of the state. Now, he was against this interference in free expression of unorthodox opinion, or opinion which was not conformist, or opinion which did not subscribe to the majority views, largely on account of 2-3 reasons, and those reasons are quite interesting. And some of the reasons one finds comparable to some other thinkers who have also argued along the same line or with the same mission, but in a different framework. For example, the first argument which Mill gives, that why there should not be any interference in free expression of any individual, even if his opinion is unorthodox or non basically conformist, or basically is rebelling against the dominant opinion. Why there should not be interference in that expression, and his opinion should be honored. He says that this entire thing he puts in terms of the question of truth, and he believes that one does know that the one opinion which is dissenting opinion or a non-conformist opinion may have some element of truth, which perhaps we are not aware at the moment. And therefore, when we honor that one dissenting non-conformist unorthodox opinion, we are basically exchanging error for truth, and this is something very important. And it is here I am basically reminded of Gandhi, and particularly his discourse of non-violence, because apart from this political angle of non-violence, there was a philosophical dimension in Gandhi, and he said that why we should go for a non-violent action, because one does know that the other side of the argument against which you are basically pitted, whether it is true or false, it may have elements of truth, and what you are standing for, what you argue for today may prove to be untrue tomorrow, and what you are contesting against in fact may become true tomorrow. So, therefore, because of this uncertainty of truth, one has only one option to argue one's case non-violently without coercing others to fall in line with oneself. So, this Gandhian position I find very similar to this position which Mill is taking on question of this truth, that thus this unorthodox opinion has to be honored, because sometimes one does not know that whether there is a truth in it or not, even if basically even if it is untrue, nonetheless it has its own value, and this he brings in other other related arguments which I will basically mention just now. The second thing he says, that why this dissenting voice, the non-conformist voice has to be honored. He said that when any issue or any argument or any position is confronted with the opposite view, then what happens? A more truer picture emerges, and it is here one can see the principle of dialectics operating, that when the two opposites collide, then something better or more a better truth emerges. This is how this dialectics is also basically perceived. Now, Mill believed that when a particular position is confronted with the opposite view, then what happens? The collision with error. In fact, even if you believe that what you are arguing for is true, even if it collides with an error, then a more clearer perception or more clearer truth will emerge through this collision with the error. So, truth, even if collides with the error, that collision is is preferable, because that collision may lead to more clarity in terms of perception and truth. Rather, it will rejuvenate the truth. So, therefore, even if you believe that your opposite side is untrue, nonetheless you allow him free play of ideas, free play of expression, because when it comes into conflict with your position, which appears to be a truth today, even then the truth and untruth, if they collide, a better position will emerge, and therefore even a dissenting voice, even if it is untrue, should not be suppressed. And the third thing is equally important. He says that nothing can be wholly true. So, the whole truth is out. Now, nothing can be stated, nothing can be believed that it is pure truth. Now, in fact, therefore, this is also very similar to this Gandhian position. Of course, it is believed that Gandhi, when he talked of this non-violence and multiplicity of truth, and he basically borrowed it from this Jainist doctrine of Shyadvad or Anekantvad, that multiplicity, there are different truth and no one has the monopoly on truth, and therefore, no position can be considered to be absolute truth. Everything is relative truth, and therefore, whatever we have to do in a non-violent fashion. So, therefore, this third position which we find in Mill on question of this minority opinion or dissenting voice or dissenting opinion, it reminds one of this Gandhian position of truth and non-violence. Now, what Mill says, that the question of the whole truth, the final truth is out. So, therefore, what happened? We are dealing with the partial truth, and therefore, when you give spaces to different opinions, different views, when you give spaces to unorthodox opinion, when you give to unconventional positions, when you give a space to non-conformist position, then what happens? That your truth gets further refined. So, there is a fine tuning and refinement of truth by doing so. Now, what happened? That in fact, he went to the extent of giving full freedom of expression even to the cranks, because he believed that even that would be perhaps better for the society in terms of enhancement of this entire endeavor in terms of attaining and moving in closer to the truth. So, in terms of this entire discourse, we find that how much importance he gave to freedom, how much importance he gave to freedom of expression and thought, and how he believed that this thought and expression of even one person, even if it doesn't subscribe or conform to the majority opinion, has to be respected. And this is very important for a democratic society today, because we are dealing with a situation world over in which we often hear that different conflicting positions emerge, and sometimes in a democracy it becomes difficult to deal with these conflicting positions, because ultimately democracy has to function according to the rule of majority, and the minority opinions get crushed. And therefore, what happens, this question of freedom of expression and censorship often comes up in different situation and different contexts. So, Mill at that time was addressing a question perhaps which had not become as prominent and as divisive as perhaps it appears to be today. So, now in terms of democracy, in terms of his idea of state intervention, state role in terms of liberty and other things, as you have seen, in fact interestingly Mill is considered to be a reluctant democrat, because he is talking about democracy, but he is also depriving many sections of the society from the kind of role which normally we consider today very important, that is the majority and the masses, because he believed the minorities should have more weightage in terms of their opinion. Therefore, he considered representative government to be very important. On question of representation, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that his position is also highly contested, because he believed that the white colonies of Australia and New Zealand, they were fit to be given the right to representation, but not the Indians, because they had yet not arrived on the scene so far as this civilizational growth was concerned. But even on question of representation as a whole, he believed that it is very important for democracy, but what type of representation one should think of, and he basically addressed these issues also in a big way. He believed that proportional representation, plural voting, and also believed that a second chamber, these are the important instruments through which democracy and democratic ideas could be promoted. But last but not the least, the issue of subjugation of women, which he picked up, was quite commendable at that time, because feminism as a discourse has crystallized much later. At that time, even women did not have the right to vote, but the kind of concern which he showed for the subjugation of women, the equality between men and women, to the extent that the book which he wrote on liberty, he in his autobiography writes that much credit goes to his wife, who was active collaborator in producing that celebrated work called Liberty. And this is how he understood the value of the woman as a community in society. So, therefore, subjugation of women is another important issue which Mill addresses. There are a number of criticisms which have been given on question of self-regarding and other regarding, in terms of his entire attempt to revive utilitarianism, in terms of giving ideas which move in direction of welfareism. Many people believe that he was essentially a liberal, wanted to modify some of the principles of liberal society in order to make it more durable and everlasting, but nonetheless it led to many contradictions in his political thought. But still, Mill we remember as a great voice so far as liberty and democracy are concerned.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session on political thoughts of J.S. Mill, that is John Stuart Mill. So, dear friends, if you have any queries and if you want to give your feedback regarding this lecture, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. We would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing on one another political thought. And if you want to access this lecture, then very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube for you, for your greater accessibility. So, we would be meeting again very soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.